Good evening. We would like to begin this session, so please have a seat. Thank you. So now we have the last keynote session. The title is Social Museology as an Agent for Change, a Trans-Disciplinary Perspective. The speakers are Ciraj Rassool and Giusy Pappalardo. So now we begin with Ciraj. His oral contribution as a title, Museums and Social Activism. The museum as process, the post-ethnographic museum and restitutionary work. I introduce Ciraj Rassool. He's professor of history at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa, and is involved in a variety of areas pertaining to history and heritage, from curatorial practices to social political issues. He's former chair of the Scientific Committee of the International Council of African Museums and is member of the UNESCO High-Level Advisory Committee of Museums. He has served on the boards of the District's 6 museums and the ITSICO Museums of South Africa and on the board of the South African Heritage Resources Agency and the National Heritage Council. Is member of the Scientific Committee for the Study of the Felix von Luschen Collection of Physical Anthropology at the Museum of Ethnology of the Staatliche Museum zu Berlin, in Germany. He is director and principal investigator of several international projects and study programs, such as Remaking Societies, Remaking Persons, Supranational Forum, and Action for African Cultural Restitution, touching on topics such as museum studies and heritage restitution. Among his publications, including books, special issues of academic journals, and numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, he also contributed to several collective works and lectures around the world on history, memory, and museums in Africa and in the global context. So, as I said, the title is Museum and Social Activism, the Museum as Process, the Post-Ethnographic Museum, and Restitutionary Work. Ciraj, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Giusy, to Manuelina, to all colleagues in MINOM, and all the younger colleagues, the senior colleagues, our founders, who have created such a wonderfully collegial atmosphere in this meeting. Because I think we're at a critical stage in the life and in the history of what we call museum. And I'm going to make an argument for restitution as forming the basis of a new museology that is emerging. And to give a sense of the conclusions that I'm going to come to, I'm going to want to make an argument for why it is important for social museology and its principles and its methods to be brought to bear upon the field of restitution. So I want to start by just giving some groundings from which I want to talk to you about these matters. I think right now we have a highly contested situation in the broad museum field, in which we have two kinds of museums and museologies at play that are in contestation with each other, in conversation with each other, in which in general I think we are living through the transition perhaps from one kind of museum to another. And that is firstly a museum that is concerned with the government of things, and with a museum of governmentality and of what we generally call care. And that I want to suggest to you historically is a museum of containment. And I want to argue to you that we have a different kind of museum and museology that has been emerging over some time. And we have listened to the most amazing accounts of some of the history of the emergence of this museum of enablement, which is also a museum rooted in social mobilization. And we've heard of references to social museology and so forth. And this contest is also between museums that are fundamentally disciplinary as part of that containment. They are contained within disciplines. And those disciplines are the ways in which societies around the world have been made knowable and contained through those disciplines. And I want to make an argument as well for the possibility of a post-disciplinary museum. And you'll notice that in English, when we put post without a hyphen, we mean that we live with a contestation over disciplines, and we live inside of the critique of disciplines, rather than suggesting that disciplines can somehow disappear. This is also a contest between the modern museum of the 19th century that continues to exist, in which citizenship is orderly and where we have generally a museum that I would describe as a museum of regulation, versus a museum and a museology of active citizenship, of civic enunciation, of social criticism, of participation, in which the idea of citizenship is not to know your place in the order of the world and which part of that world you belong to, but rather where the citizenship is rooted in an ability to question and an ability to enunciate yourself. And this is also a distinction between a conventional museum and museology, in which museum is the collection, or it's an exhibition, and it's usually marked by a physical edifice, that it's usually an architecture. Whereas the concept of museum that we are using nowadays through social museology and through the museum of process is one in which the museum itself is a process of becoming. The museum is a knowledge transaction. And so this background that I want to give also needs to talk about disciplines, something that has largely been absent in our discussion over the last day and a half. And the conventional museum is marked by a fundamental discipline between those deemed to have culture and civilization and those who live outside of time, who only have culture, who only have tradition, and whose material culture is usually to be found in the ethnographic museum. Now, I don't have time to unpack the different histories of ethnology and ethnography in different colonial histories around the world. And I will admit to you that we have a very complex story, especially in the Americas, in Latin America, in Mexico, where anthropology has managed to invent itself as the discipline of liberation, as the discipline that's on the side of the poor. On the African continent, however, the ethnographic has been the discipline of colonial containment and of knowing those who have been colonized. And so the ethnographic is something that many of us have made an argument for needing to be dismantled. And there are various other kinds of distinctions that we make, and we witness all over Europe the different ways in which the ethnographic museum has continued to be kind of re-inscribed and as world museums. But fundamentally, when you look, for example, at the formation of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which is described by our German colleagues without any shame as being the museum of non-European culture, without any sense of understanding the teachings of Stephen Bantu Biko in South Africa about how we do not want to be knowable in the negative. We are not the negative people. So the whole concept, the founding principle of the Humboldt Forum is fundamentally outmoded and colonial in its very nature. So we need to be able to think about all of the disciplines through which we have made museums and through which we have come to know museums. And how it is that colonialism is not something that is in the past. And we have many examples of exhibitions that have been made, very powerful exhibitions that have suggested that colonialism is something that is behind us. It is something that is now merely a legacy. And there are so many ways in which we can understand how colonialism continues to live with us. There are schools of thought that talk about coloniality, that you can be marked by colonialism without having had a colonialism in formal terms. And that is why we think about societies like Austria, Switzerland as marked by colonialism, and we even think about societies like Ethiopia as equally marked by colonialism. And one of the major contestations that is at play in these debates about museums and on the future of museums is about what is the place of expertise? What is the relationship between the expert and the people? Is this merely a one-way relationship? Is it a relationship of hierarchies of knowledge in which we've seen an example in the last few days of experts having knowledge, but of communities having experience, which leads us to ask questions about what happens when communities are able to demonstrate their expertise, which is in many ways better than those of experts, where we begin to question expertise, and where the museum becomes the space in which knowledge relations are rendered as politics, and that we try to understand the knowledge transactions and contestations as the very basis of our museology. We have also come to learn about how much our notions of care that have accompanied our work with museums has concealed the extent to which museums are institutions made of fundamental violence. And we have been learning in the last few years just the extent to which the museum might be dripping with blood. So, in thinking about these matters, I quickly, without having, and I would have revised this much more with what I've learned in the last few days, of trying to think about social museology in relation to these new museum forms, such as memorial museums, of of eco-museums and the relationship between those with what we call community museums, and what it is about the community-ness of museums that enables community museums to be a certain kind of radical museology. And I want us to make a distinction here between social museology and what we can think of as social movement museums, in which the museum impetus is about the mobilization of people, and where the museum is a movement rather than a place. And we need to worry about and think about how those two museologies of containment and enablement continue to live together, and what those contests are in that relationship between these museologies, how they exist simultaneously, side by side. And we've been discussing this simultaneity in thinking about the relationship between MINOM and ICOM, about the transformations in ICOM, and in how this relationship has been unfolding over the last few years. And there is a big scholarship here that I'm not going to go into, but that our concepts of museum as forum are beginning to reveal that is not as radical a concept as it originally proposed itself to be. That the concept of shared authority and of co-curatorship that many of our colleagues are working with might indeed be a new form of appropriation and subordination to expertise. So I want to talk about the museum, the social movement museum that I know best, in District 6 in Cape Town, a museum that many of you might have visited and might have read about and would know about as one of the flagship museums in the world that expresses this new idea of the museum as social mobilization, and a museum that is in its very nature critical of the expertise of the so-called expert. And what is it that makes the museology, the social movement museology of the District 6 Museum? That it's a space of enunciation, debate, and inscription, of the people interfering inside of the space, that it is a combative and contested space of public scholarship, and that it has inaugurated this idea of the museum being the process of the ongoing making of the museum as a radical new museology. And it's a discussion that I've had with some colleagues for many years about trying to think about the relationship between that social movement museum on the African continent and social museology. And a few years ago, we had the opportunity to do that through the partnership that District 6 Museum had with Museo da Maré, in the conversations that we had between African museums and Latin American museums, such as in the UNESCO process of drafting those recommendations. And so these are the kinds of ideas about this social movement museology, about articulation, contestation, and about the museum operating as a hybrid space of research, representation, and pedagogy, brokering and mediating relations of knowledge and varied kinds of intellectual and cultural practice. So I want to turn now to this other domain that I think has unfortunately been absent from the discussions that I think we need to have as we take on board indigenous museologies, as we think about museum formations, museums and knowledge formation in post-colonies, in societies of the world that were formerly colonized, as we think about our relationships with European societies. And this opens up the possibility of inaugurating the post-ethnographic. In other words, living with the legacies of the ethnographic, but also pointing towards a life without the ethnographic. That for us on the African continent, we are more and more convinced about the extent to which the ethnographic was a fundamental part of our colonization and of our colonial occupation. And of course, we need a much more sophisticated understanding of what we mean by the ethnographic, what we mean by the ethnological, what concepts we use in all the languages that we have, and recognizing that there isn't a singular ethnographic, of the difference between the ethnographic as a form of research and the ethnographic as a form of containment. About the difference that our German colleagues make, for example, between anthropologie and ethnologie, of ethnologie being social anthropology, but anthropology being physical anthropology. And so we need to think about these contestations that are happening in the problematization of the ethnographic museum. We are now living in a phase, in a stage of restitution, where restitution is becoming more and more urgent, more and more important in the museum work that we do, in which we are having a certain kind of reckoning with colonialism. I had the fortune more than 10 years ago of participating in a restitution of the remains of our ancestors, which had been stolen from their graves in the Northern Cape and taken, shipped to a scientific institution in Austria, along with sound recordings, photographs, film, material culture, rock engravings that had been chopped out of the earth. And we were able to find the records of a legal inquiry which led our Austrian colleagues to understand that they had acquired these remains of the dead illegally. And what we have learned, there's so many things that we are learning every day. And this is not just a question of language. In Germany, where I do a lot of work, our German colleagues do not have a word for restitution. As much as our German colleagues think they are doing restitution when they translate their work into English, they are in fact doing what they call Rückgabe, what our Dutch colleagues are also increasingly calling teruggabe, instead of using a much more powerful term that they are able to, terugbezorging, which is a much more caring term. This idea of Rückgabe and teruggabe is purely a process of giving. Now, of course, we recognize that in North America, Australia and New Zealand, where there are sovereignty problems with indigenous people recognizing the legitimacy of national governments, the concept of repatriation has been very important in those societies. On the African continent, however, we prefer to use the term restitution, because restitution is not a politics of giving. Restitution is instead a politics of demanding. And restitution will not succeed if it is only a process of European giving. And we are also seeing the way in which, in Germany, certainly one of the leaders in the Rückgabe field, the way in which restitution is happening firmly and neatly within European categories of museum governance. So in the case of the return of 1,000 skulls to Rwanda from Berlin, they did not choose to do an inquiry into the full collection of the Polish anthropologist Czechanowski, who acquired 1,000 skulls from Rwanda. but who also made sound recordings, who also collected material culture. So you have this return that is happening within disciplines. And we are also learning about the concepts that we use. In our restitution that took place in 2012 from Austria to South Africa of the remains of our ancestors Klaas and Troy Pienaar, we made an argument for the restitution as being one of rehumanization, coming back to a concept used by Bruno right at the beginning. Now, if we turn that term rehumanization into a practice of restitution, in other words, into restitutionary work, what does it ask us to do? It asks us to think about deaccessioning as a first stage of taking the remains of what is referred to in museums as human remains out of the collection, in which they stop being human remains, which is the concept of museum governance, and it is the concept of human biology. And you recognize that these are the remains of ancestral dead people. These are the remains of people who are being rehumanized, in which they cease to be objects. And we also recognize that belongings to people and societies, when acquired by museums, were objectified and turned into objects. So there's no ahistorical concept of museum object that we have. We need to think about the object historically and how they were turned into objects, and how restitution will lead to a process of de-objectification and even possibly de-museumization. So, and this is very important, because in the case of the return of ancestral remains, human biology should not be the discipline that speaks for the dead. That we need to talk about communities of care and about how this is the work of mourning. That restitution indeed is a much more complex process that is not an overnight event to be celebrated in a garden of a parliamentary building, but that restitution is going to be with us for a long time. Restitution, I think, is inaugurating a new museum and a new museology, and indeed opening up opportunities within MINOM and within the broad field of social museology to take its principles and its methods of mobilization and of thinking about museum as process into advancing the cause of restitution. Because restitution is something that we need to continue to theorize, and we need to borrow from what our colleagues in the broad field of social museology have given to us as a way of advancing that field of restitution that is going to be with us for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ciraj. Thanks a lot. Just for a question of time, I ask sorry, to Giusy to begin. So I introduce Giusy, even if everybody knows her. Giusy is professor of urbanistic technique and planning at the University of Catania. During her academic career, she has received several fellowships, including a Fulbright fellowship as a visiting scholar at Mississippi State University. She's also participated in several courses and workshops, including those focused on the use of open technologies for land use planning and the acquisition of action research tools. Research experiences have extended to projects funded by the Sicilian region. She conducts research at the University of Catania, as I said, and their publication include books and special issues on academic journals in peer review journals. The title of our oral contribution is Intersection between Social Museology and Community-Based Planning.
Thank you, and I want to start my brief keynote address to not just referring to what Ciraj has just said. I would have said intersections between planning, and I will explain what my position in planning and museology of social movement, and I think that was very inspiring to rethink this definition of moving and the idea of the focus on process. That is what I think is one of the core of Ciraj keynote. And again, one of the questions that is as raised that are of concern for museums and museologists, the transition between containment to enablement, the idea that citizenship is the ability to question reality and to enable to be in the world and to question what world we want, and also to move from the concept of disciplines to a concept of liberation, of post-disciplines. I have to say that all these concepts are at the core of the debate also of planning. And when I talk about urban planning, I talk from a perspective of an approach that deals more with social actors than stones. So, of course, planning as a discipline has the very different and diverse traditions as museology has, and the perspective I'm talking from is the one that values the role of humanizing planning, just to recall some concepts that have been introduced from our first keynote. And I also want to say rehumanize and thinking also on a more than human dimension, that is considering us as and humans as a center for restarting thinking how to inhabit the world, but that's a world that we don't inhabit alone. And that's another point that I would like to add to the discussion, because in these days, I think in some of the parallel sessions, this has been very central also, and this comes a lot from the indigenous perspective, and I think that has to be at the core of our final reflections. So as I said, again, I'm an urban planner that is more concerned with social actors than with stones and building. And so for this reason, I had the opportunity to witness that the process that leads to a result is sometimes more important than the result itself. So the first concept I want to share with you as a key that we have discussed in this day is the concept of process. And also when Ciraj before talked about restitution, he talked about a process of restitution. When we are talking about social museology or museums of social movements, we are talking about process. So I think one of the pillars of our discussion is embedded into this word, this process. And so going back to my discipline, as process is the key. I think that when discussed about that, we know that people involved in a plan, in a project, are the key of the transformation. And so the key of the transformation is related to the ability that people involved have to learn and to learn collectively. And if this process is able to enable collective learning, that's what generates more than the result itself. So what I'm trying to make is that the approach of urban planning I'm talking about is an approach that doesn't look at the result, but looks more on the way we arrive to the result. And I think this is what is embedded also in many of the experiences that have been shared in these days. And again, this makes the point of the importance of focusing on processes rather than just looking at results. And again, this is very related with many of the experiences we have talked about. And again, if we think as museum, not just as institutions, but at the people that constitute that and generate their process, we can identify there as catalysts for change. And I think that that was another point of what we have discussed so far. So identifying the people that make museums as catalysts, and this means opening their door, the door of museums, and focus their action to the opportunity to the way we transform the place we live. And so this intersection with the urban planning debate means that on one side, if you have museum and museum people involved in collective learning processes and that are able to move from the memory dimension, if you intersect them with the action of urban planners that are more focused on how we rethink the present and rethink the future, maybe the intersection between this world, museology on one side that is concerned with memory but also has a look on the future, and urban planning on the other side that has a look on the future, but it has to be rooted on the past. I think that the alliances between these domains of knowledge and action can be very important, and that's why I think that this conference has brought to my disciplinary perspective a lot of new ideas and concepts to rethink. And what I would like to add from my disciplinary perspective to the museology perspective is the idea that all the memory we process together, all the memory we use as a collective learning process, it's something that has to catalyze change. So just to clarify the reason that was behind this conference of intersecting these two fields of knowledge and action, and the idea that this alliance could generate change because it stands between a reflection on the past, that is what museology is more concerned about, and the idea that this reflection on the past can really shape the future. And I think we can reflect upon that and try to explore more possibilities of interaction in the future debate, but opening this intersection is something that was not, to my knowledge, so common and doesn't used to be at the center of many debate. And thanks to this moment, I had the opportunity to add more to this, and I hope this will open future reflections. So this was just to clarify why I thought it was important to intersect our points of view into this conference. And now, before closing, I don't have too much time, so I had to make it very short, and you will find a complete version of what I wanted to share with you in the website with translations. Let me just close this thanking more of the people that have been involved into this conference, because again, as we think that the process that leads to a result is more important than the result itself, I think that also the process that has led to this conference is even more important, or where we are now. So I just want to recall some of the steps and the people that have really contributed to make this happen. And so let me just start with first of all, with the people that have been selected thanks to an ICOM scholarship that is being funded by the Strategic Allocation Review Fund of ICOM. And these people, I hope they are there. And if they are there, I ask them to stand up as Anna Svarts, Deborah Neves, Giulia Morim, Lisa Pigozzi, Mauricio Cucimba Castro, Mutoni Tangua, Pedro dos Santos Mota, Sandra Maria Teixeira, Sara Braca, and Susan Alson Caninde. First of all, I would like you to thank them because they were able to make this experience very vibrant, bringing here their perspective from the different countries they represent, trying to make this conference very diverse and really an arena of confrontation between different places of the world. So first of all, let me thank them, and we all thank them. So, also, they have been greatly assisted by the other volunteers who have come to the conference with the aim of supporting this complex machine. First of all, let me thank the group of MINOM Portugal that has been a great partner in this conference, and also the people from Lusofono University, Natalia Pamio, Adel Pausini, that together with Manuel Antunes later will lead an important moment of this conference, that is the General Assembly. Where we are going to discuss one important document, and I want to add something about that, that is the Librino Declaration. And let me clarify this point too, because I think it's crucial and key to our discussion. So as you know, before the conference, we had 2 days of workshop that has been conducted in the neighborhood of Librino, that is a marginal neighborhood close to Catania. And the idea behind that was that we want to broad part of the conference to those places that are usually not included into these events. So it was a symbolic choice to go there. And from an urban planning perspective, that was a key choice, because we want to make the argument and the point that what has been considered marginal so far, it is actually a place where change can happen, and social change is happening in neighborhoods like that. And we have witnessed that because we have been working with people that day by day are committed to social change. And in a way, their work is a work of a museology of social movement, as Ciraj has just defined. I also would like to use these 5 minutes that I have to clarify to some people that have contributed to the workshop the reason why we have been working mainly with anchor institutions rather than with residents of the neighborhood, because some people from the workshop have pointed out that yes, we have worked, we have been there, but we didn't have contact with the everyday people, with the residents of the neighborhood, and I think that that critique was a very good one. But the point is that if you go in a neighborhood like Librino for just 2 days, for something that is very important for us, but think of working class people that has to go work every day and they don't have so much time to dedicate us. So yes, that was a pity not having a direct contact with the residents, because I do believe that the really agent of change are the people who live in place, and we should, as planners and museology, engage more with this. But on the other side, please consider the opportunity that just for 2 days, it was not the case of bothering them that have to go to work every day, and we were just, you know, visiting that place and then come back. But I hope that having contacted some anchor institutions that were there, I hope that that was an opportunity to incorporate in our final declaration all the inputs that they have given us. So when we are going to discuss this final declaration, and this is going to happen in a while because we are going to have the final assembly discussing that, I think it's going to be very important that we have experienced for 2 days a marginal context that has given us a lot of inputs to reflect more about our role in those contexts. And I want to finish. So let me conclude this speech by saying that, well, we have had a lot of contribution from people participating, all members of MINOM who have honored us to be there. We also would like to thank Hugues Devarin, even if he was for a very short time with us, and we apologize for the technical problems we had, but his contribution is always very important for this community of thinkers and practitioners and activists that we are. Also thanking Mario Moutinho, Giudice Primo, Mario Chagas, that I know are many of you as a key reference in your contributions and speeches. But before closing everything, I would like to say that I think that the most important living legacy of this conference is the local organizing group that has really done a great job assisting all of us in these days. So these young students and scholars who have worked tirelessly and with dedication toward a common goal, that is to make it possible to think of a conference in a different way, not as a stage to demonstrate and reaffirm hierarchies and unbalanced power structures, but as an arena of experimentation for working horizontally, where the effort of what we do with our hands and our minds empower us as people of equal rights and different backgrounds, expertise, worldviews, yet respectful of each other. So for this reason, I would like to call all of them, and I also would like them to stand as we did with the scholarship holders. So if you are here, please stand up, and still alive, I don't know, because after these days, maybe some of you is not here anymore. Adriana Russo, Elison Drago, Angela La Rosa, Giovanni Raciti, Giulia Tringali, please stand up, Greta Tommasi, Lorenzo Napodano, Maria Chiara Raccuia, Roberto Endovina, Silvia Majorana, Valentina Del Campo. So really, without these people, anything of this would be possible. So thank them. And please let me thank all our colleagues from this department and from my department, and the two people who made this possible, that are tireless workers, inspiring thinkers, attentive listeners, caring human beings, that are Federica Santagati and Manuelina Duarte. I need to do this because they have been great companions in this. And I stop now because I know that in a few minutes we will also welcome our rector.
It seems that we'll arrive in 20, 30 minutes.
Ah, so we have time.
Yeah, but they told me now.
Okay, so now so what about if, as we have to run, now we have an important task, that is the one of ending up this, what we have reflected up to this moment and discussed today and yesterday in keynote and parallel session, and most important, what we have produced during the days of workshop now has to be discussed into the General Assembly. So I would close this and open the General Assembly. Of course, if any of you have questions and we want to engage now in a discussion, we have time to do that, and then we continue this, opening the assembly that is important for many reasons. We have to do the elections of MINOM, but again, most important, we have to discuss, and there has been a lot of contribution, the declaration of this conference, of this MINOM conference. So thank you for being here up to the end of this, and if you want to discuss with Ciraj and me now, we have time for questions and comments, and then we move to the assembly. Thank you.
So, it was funny for me because it's my almost first experience about social museology, and when Ciraj has spoken, I felt like someone was beginning to swim in the high sea, and yeah, I'm trying to go always farther. So I catched some important issues, and some of them I think that we can hear them in the speech of Mario Chagas in the video that it was so kind to leave us. So. Museums as a process of becoming, a process of transaction. Is that the words of Ciraj, but of course there is a sea of common points to find. And I'm very happy that students are here because they are very interested in new museology, and many of them asked to have a thesis about these arguments. So, yeah, if there is someone who is interested, who wants to ask something, yes.
I must say I'm quite happy by the ending of this conference. The message that we have had on restitution is something like the message we had 40 years ago on new museology. So we have work for 40 more years, and let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ciraj, for your wonderful ideas that, of course, resonate very well with emerging museology in Africa. But I would like you to tell me a little bit more why you chose to use the words universal museum and co-curatorship in the same sentence, because the idea of universal museum is a passive-aggressive way of resisting repatriation of the collections that are held in Western museums. And as a result, in my view, a way of denying the process or the lack of provenance and the processes that took these collections where they are at the moment, which is slavery, you know, the brutal process or history of colonialism. So when we use this two, it suggests that co-curation is a friendly process where we agree on many things, but I find that there's a very big gap between de-accessioning, as you suggested, and actually bringing those collections back home. Thank you.
Mutoni reminds me of a very important moment that we had in Mombasa. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, shortly after Dr. George Abungu was removed from the directorship of the National Museums of Kenya. And the National Museums of Kenya, the International Council of African Museums, and CHEDA had a partnership with the British Council that brought colleagues from the University of East Anglia, particularly our colleague John Mack, to talk about partnerships and co-curatorships. And you're very right that the idea of co-curatorship and of shared collections and of all of us being entangled with each other was an anti-restitution argument. And John Mack, as the main theorist of the Universal Museum, went further than that to suggest that in European cities there are people of African origin who need to be close to what he called those objects, and also that there were African curators who were caring for those collections. And you will remember Hassan Arero and the other colleagues who were the late Claude Ardouin, and who had been brought to different museums in Britain, mainly to the British Museum. I mean, in the case of the British Museum and that argument of being a universal museum, caring for collections on behalf of the whole humanity, with giving it to itself an authority, was of course just found to be so wanting just a few months ago, when we learnt just the extent to which the collections inside of that museum had been stolen without any record and with a very poor sense of provenance research in spite of its claims. So that whole argument of the Universal Museum was blown out of the water. But much of our museum field and the concepts that we have come from a certain kind of experience of colonialism and of decolonization in the Pacific that comes to us, say, through the work of our colleague Nick Thomas, that comes through the exhibition that was in Britain about 6 or 7 years ago called Oceania, and also in the work of the colleagues who work in the Pacific called Curatopia, about shared collections, about co-curatorship, about that being what was for them a radical museology. So what we are talking about here is fundamentally a process that is quite distinct from art washing, but as wanting to put museums on a much more fundamentally ethical footing. And we need to look restitution in the eye when we admit to histories of violence, when we admit to histories of plunder, and when we admit to histories of acquisition under violent colonial conditions. So restitution is something that is very important, and our colleagues in different countries in Europe are moving closer and closer to the idea of restitution. In Britain, university museums and smaller museums are moving more quickly in that direction. But I can tell you that within the next few years, you know, the dam walls have been broken. And within a few years, we will hear the talk of restitution coming from the British Museum and the V&A Museum. But we need to be very careful about the way in which restitution could be appropriated into a project of a new gentrification. That is not going to mean restitution at all. But restitution has got to be accompanied by other processes, because it doesn't do anyone any justice to bring possessions and belongings back from an ethnographic museum in Europe to a colonially constructed ethnographic museum on the African continent. We need to go through an epistemic process of removing these belongings outside of the governance system of the museum and outside of the disciplines that it created in order to create the relationship between the governance of things and the governance of people. Becoming free and becoming equal and becoming equal human beings in the world means that we have to decommission the ethnographic. And we need to think about museum in a new way that enables an equal humanity for everyone in the world. Mais pergunta, por favor.
We saw this afternoon a presentation of Museu das Remoções, how that showing how their collections entered the National Museum, National Historic Museum in Rio de Janeiro. Do you see perspectives in short time that big museums in Europe will do this kind of actions to really include the communities in long-term activities, not only in temporary exhibitions, but also in collections and in the team, in the, how can I say, the professional workers. Vou traduzir em português, deu um exemplo que foi citado hoje à tarde sobre o Museu das Remoções, quando a coleção do museu entra na coleção do Museu Histórico Nacional. Eu perguntei ao Ciraj se ele vê perspectivas de, na Europa, em curto tempo, os grandes museus fazerem esse tipo de ação, de incorporar questões da comunidade em ações mais permanentes, como coleção ou mesmo na equipe do museu, e não somente em ações de participação em exposições temporárias, que é o que já é mais comum.
There are a number of examples of this engagement that is happening between museums, large museums and old museums, and communities from societies of their collections. There we can look at what happened in the journey that was made by people from East Africa, from Kenya, from Tanzania, to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Britain, in which people made a journey to the collections under the category of Maasai. And to look at the process of what occurred in the collection, in that encounter, and to worry about the extent to which that encounter was more than a temporary, needed to be more than a temporary reauthorization of the collection in the museum. And to ask questions about journeys, not just about sharing and co-curatorship in that way, but to ask questions about legitimacy, about authority, and the very kinds of questions that were asked in one of the first provenance projects between our colleagues in the Museums Association of Namibia and the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, in Dahlem, that is now been incorporated into the Humboldt Forum, which was originally going to be a project of identifying a limited amount of objects for the process from Namibia to be temporarily loaned to Namibians, with a limited funding for that project. Well, when those objects came back to Namibia, the laws of Namibia made it impossible for those objects to be returned. So a loan was automatically turned into a permanent return, and in which our colleagues in the National Museums Association, I think, built up a certain kind of authority. Now, when we talk about large national museums in Latin America, bearing in mind the events that happened in that museum in Rio de Janeiro. I can only talk about what has happened in our National Museum in Cape Town, in which there are ongoing projects of engagement that happen with local communities, that think about the possibilities of borrowing, much like happens at Te Papa in New Zealand with local Maori communities, that thinks about how to change the meaning of what is in the collection from something that is regarded as ethnographic, that underwent a process of ethnologization and objectification, and to turn it into belongings of the people. When you do that, we get to a stage where we learn the extent to which the process of objectification in museums have done violence to those possessions and belonging. And so there is so much work. There is not a single model. And this is the work that is restitutionary, that is restorative, that is the work of restorative justice, of dignity, of bringing dignity to the people and bringing dignity to the museum, that has no predetermined outcome, in which restitution is a necessary process of social museology, and that we have to learn to walk that road together.
Thank you. So now we have director of the University of Catania. Sorry, we just have director, 1 minute, and then we can go on later. Okay. Ciao.
Good afternoon, it is for me really a pleasure to come here and to welcome all of you. I know it's the end of this two-day conference, and it was not possible for me to come before, but I really wanted to be here to really thank, first of all, the organizers, and thank Federica Santagati and Giusy Pappalardo and all the organizers of this conference, and the foundation Federico II with Patrizia Monterosso, and that really made this possible, and to thank all of you for being here in Catania, in our university, from all different parts of the world. Well, in these 2 days, this 21st International Conference, Rethinking Museologies. And, well, I think that's very important, and I thank you personally for what you are doing in your place, in your universities, working and rethinking the way museum should actually appear. Because all of us, we do research, and we do research, but the real impact for the society is actually to show what this is, to show our cultural heritage, to show really all the different parts thanks to the museum. And the way museums are done, the way we rethink the impact that we do have in society is really, I do think, extremely important. Well, I mean, I'm a scientist. Let's think and let's talk about science. Well, before pandemics, actually, in every country, in Italy in particular, when you want to cut something, you do cut science. And therefore, we had every time at universities, at research, funds lower and lower. But after pandemics, the society understood really on the shoulder of each of us that only through science it is possible to go beyond and to win the great challenges that are faced by the society. And in particular, if we are now over, is just thanks to science, thanks to research. So showing how science, how cultural heritage, how really the research has an impact is extremely important. And is important for the research itself, is important for the human being. And in fact, in our university, University of Catania, we do have a system of museum that we value very much, and we work on it. So let me really thank all of you for working in this field, and I'm sure that these 2 days you actually had new ideas, new ways of having a proper impact to the society. For the rest, I hope that all of those who came from abroad have also the time to enjoy Sicily, to enjoy this beautiful place where we are. I mean, this wonderful monastery, we are very proud of it. And also our city, our Mount Etna, and to have the time to remain a bit more than this conference and enjoy. So thanks for coming and good work, and really thanks again to the organizers for having done this.
Thanks a lot, Director, because he had the time to come here to say hello, and his greetings are very important for us. As you know, we had some supporters for this conference. One is Fondazione Federico II. Later, we will thank the Fondazione Federico II in 5 languages, and we are recording it. So they know that they will have the thanks in 5 languages. So it's important because, you know, we had the possibility to have simultaneous translation. That's not so common, having not a big fund, so it's very important. So thank you again. Thanks a lot for coming. Okay. Yeah.
Bom, compreendendo as barreiras da limitação do idioma, né? Então, dentro do que me foi traduzido, das falas que foram feitas, eu quero fazer uma consideração que eu acho que é muito importante, que a gente pare com esse vício acadêmico de escolher palavras bonitas para falar de coisas feias. Quando a nossa companheira fala de objetos que devem ser devolvidos por grandes museus, nós estamos falando, nos referindo a reparações históricas que compreendem, que vão muito além de objetos retidos em grandes museus. Na verdade, estamos falando de roubos históricos. Estamos falando de países que hoje são grandes potências, mas que essa economia potente foi constituída a partir de roubos imensos de outros países. Então, não foram só objetos que foram retirados desses países, foram fortunas, riquezas, isso compreende muita coisa, isso vai muito além. Então, não importa se o uso que vai ser feito por esses museus, essa atitude de falar que, para devolver esses objetos, é preciso repensar, ver como isso vai ser utilizado, como isso vai ser feito, e a apropriação que vai ser feita dentro desses museus, não importa. Eu prefiro que um museu, que tenha um museu do meu país, que seja hegemônico, que clássico, conservador, ainda assim, eu prefiro que os objetos do meu país, da minha memória, da minha cultura, estejam na minha casa, do que num outro imenso, maravilhoso, de um outro país. Então, é sobre isso que nós estamos falando. Não é sobre o valor, a objetificação, o valor desses objetos materiais. Nós estamos falando do poder da memória. Nós estamos falando de roubos históricos, apropriações e reparações que até hoje não foram feitas. Então, é preciso repensar, sim, e escolher muito bem as palavras na hora de dar a explicação para o que foi colocado. É isso.
So Sandra wanted us to leave with, sorry, is it this one? Okay. Sandra wanted us to keep in mind, although during all that time, during the workshops and the conference, we were using words, beautiful words, to describe things that were ugly. She wanted us to remind that all the things that are in the museums are still there, and that, how do you say, I'm sorry, I feel in the spot because it's very difficult, and at the same time it's very true. She wanted to remember that the museums are still here, and there's still a fight to restitute, and that the most important is not about what is discussed, but that's what we still need to be doing. Voilà, avec beaucoup de violence, with a lot of violence. They were stolen, objects were stolen and then put into museum. The very powerful countries that have those museums, they became powerful by stealing those objects and this wealth. The wealthy. Avec, si, do you want to?
The very end of her speech, it's about the returning the objects of the big museums, the traditional museums, to their countries that were stolen, has to be the way the local museums want to be. She prefers that the objects still on our countries, that still remain in the imperial countries, because the object is closer to us in our country and inaccessible in other countries. So returning back could not be disciplinated by the big museums, the big European museums. But this is about our memory, and our memory it's not, could not be put, the value of our memory could not be put in the object like a monetary value, but a cultural value.
Thank you.
I have one word to reply to that in Brazilian Portuguese. Exactamente.
Alguma pergunta? More questions? Se for em português, só façam de frase em frase, a gente fica mais fácil traduzir. Não?
So now we are beginning the work for the General Assembly, and we ask to Adel Pausini.
Adel Pausini, Manuel Antunes, Natalia Pamio, please come here and we can start the MINOM General Assembly. Okay.